Welcome to Tokyo Wave, recorded in a live studio in Harajuku, Japan, with your hosts Aaron and Parker.
Alright everyone, welcome to episode 13 of Tokyo Wave. We're your hosts, Aaron Randall
and Parker Allen. On Tokyo Wave, we bring you weekly updates from our studio in Harajuku.
Join us in segments featuring this week's top news,
Political happenings,
business,
and as always, the gong.
From Hollywood, it's the Gong Show.
Alright, so getting us started with This Week in Japan. Here are this week's top news highlights.
Japan to ease travel curbs on Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and Vietnam.
Campaigning for Tokyo governor election begins.
7 people accused of illegal online fertilizer sales.
This Week in Japan.
First up, this is our top news item. Japan is looking to ease travel curbs on Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and Vietnam. Prime Minister Abe said in a press conference on June 18th that Japan is advancing talks to ease its entry ban on Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and Vietnam.
So right now, Japan still has an entry ban in place to stem the spread of the novel coronavirus, which applies to foreign nationals coming from any of the 111 listed countries.
So, with these new set of rules, business people from these 4 countries will be allowed into Japan, but only on the condition that they test negative for the virus and use a smartphone app that tracks their movement using GPS to aid in contact tracing.
At a meeting of the government task force on the coronavirus response, Abe said the 4 countries were chosen because they have the coronavirus under control and that travel restrictions on other parts of the world will be eased later as the situation improves.
This does not mean all foreign travelers arriving from Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, or Vietnam will be allowed in. This will only apply to citizens of these 4 countries who are traveling between Japan and their home country, otherwise saying that you can't escape from one of the banned countries to one of these 4 countries and find a way to get into Japan. It won't work like that.
That's a critical point worth mentioning. So business people such as executives, technical staff, and those participating in the technical intern training program will also be eligible. Students will have to wait longer before they can enter Japan, which will be later followed by tourists.
All arrivals from these 4 countries, including Japanese nationals, have to submit an itinerary detailing where they plan to visit during the first 14 days of their stay in Japan. They are also going to be forbidden from using public transportation during this 14-day period.
Oof, wow, that's tough. As we said, Japan currently has this entry ban in place for 111 countries, including the United States, much of Asia, including China and South Korea, and all of Europe. Barring special circumstances, foreign travelers who have been to these areas within 14 days of arriving in Japan are being turned away.
Prime Minister Abe said in the press conference that we will continue with border measures to prevent imported cases of the coronavirus. At the same time, we need to resume international travel partially and gradually in order to put the economy on a recovery track.
According to the Japanese Foreign Ministry, Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi and his Thai counterpart Don Pramudwinai agreed to discuss the resumption of essential travel between the 2 countries.
Foreign travelers from Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and Vietnam will have to take a PCR test before and after arriving in Japan and test negative both times.
The 4 countries are expected to place similar requirements on Japanese business people when mutual travel resumes, likely this summer, though the exact details are still under negotiation.
Prime Minister Abe has already instructed the Health Ministry and other relevant government organizations to set up testing centers to administer these PCR tests to people who are departing the country.
In addition to this business track, Japan is also considering a residence track that allows more people into the country as long as they agree to a mandatory 14-day quarantine period, among other requirements.
So this plan is being designed with expats working for foreign companies in Japan in mind. So I guess that kind of sort of includes us.
Yeah.
Maybe,
more or
maybe
less.
not.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy. They finally sound like they are going to accommodate foreign residents of Japan.
Yep. That's the big thing that we've been really looking into and worrying about. Hopefully they come up with a framework soon so we have some official documentation and guidance on how to proceed.
Yes, we've, what is it? We're now in almost 3 months of being officially stuck in Japan.
I think
Help!
I told one of my friends about that the other day, and he's like, dude, that's not such a bad place to be stuck in.
Yeah, honestly, I wouldn't want to be stuck anywhere else.
Yeah. All right, so up next, campaigning for Tokyo governor election begins.
Campaigning for the Tokyo gubernatorial election officially kicked off Thursday with incumbent Governor Yuriko Koike facing a record 21 challengers.
So, in the July 5th election, a total of 22 people, the most for any Tokyo gubernatorial election to date, have filed their candidacies with the capital's election board.
So these 22 candidates are expected to largely campaign online in order to avoid drawing crowds of people together, which is obviously a major concern during the ongoing coronavirus pandemic.
Wow, so they're going to need lots of help with digital marketing and Facebook ads and...
Well, yes and no. We could do a whole nother podcast on this, but there are a lot of restrictions on what politicians are and are not allowed to do during an election campaign.
So is this a Google Facebook thing or is this a Japan government thing?
It's a Japan government thing. So because of Japan's public elections law, once the election has been called, candidates are not allowed to purchase online ads.
Wow.
However, they are allowed to post to Twitter, Facebook, on social media, as long as what they're doing is not paid.
Wow.
However, they also cannot do certain things like directly encouraging voters to vote, etc. There are various extremely strict rules that these politicians and their offices have to adhere to in order to stay in compliance with this law.
Can they get like a, what is it called in the States? Like when these political groups that are usually affiliated with one running governor, what are those groups called?
PACs?
Yeah. The PACs. Can they get a PAC to buy online ads for them if they wanted to?
No, they cannot.
So this is probably an extreme contrast to the States, right?
Yes.
Where as soon as they announce running for election, they probably have a private call with Google execs about, $1 billion ad deal.
Well, and so in Japan, up until the election is announced, and so there's like this election period. So the time until the election period starts is actually okay to run ads.
Ah, okay. Gotcha.
But once the election has actually been officially, the election, basically the campaigning time, once that period has begun, it's no longer okay to run online ads.
Wow. Much respect for Japan in that sense. So Koike, 67, who became the first female Tokyo governor in 2016, is running for re-election as an independent candidate without the support of any party.
In a 2-minute-long video posted online after filing her candidacy, Koike said that, "We are working to provide a thorough healthcare and testing system in the event of a second wave of virus infections."
She also vowed to step up support for the virus-hit economy and said, "I will continue to fight to protect the future of Tokyo residents."
Part of this is obviously what is Tokyo going to do in order to stem the spread of the coronavirus. Obviously, that is at the tip top of everyone's mind right now. Koike has actually proposed developing a Tokyo equivalent to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is a national public health institute in the United States, in order to prepare for a possible second wave of virus infections.
I love it. I think Japan should get right on it. That sounds like a great idea. There's been a lot of criticisms of the WHO and I don't know so much about
The WHO?
The WHO.
Yeah. The loudest organization in the world.
You know, Japan should definitely have its own local organization to look into these things.
The other candidates for the Tokyo gubernatorial election include Kenji Utsunomiya, Taro Yamamoto, and a bunch of other people who honestly have absolutely no chance of winning.
It's all about building that platform. I think the Democrats in the U.S. did the same thing this past time, right? We had about 22 people, you know.
Well, it's really funny. I mean, to give you a sense of how unoptimistic the opposition are, this Kenji Utsunomiya, I almost feel sorry for him because this is his third time to run for the governorship.
Oh, wow.
And it'll be the third time that he loses. I mean, I hate to sound like an inconsiderate person, but I mean, he was old when he ran the first time.
Yeah.
And Taro Yamamoto is an actor turned politician, and last year he actually made quite a stir when he created the new political party Reiwa Shinsengumi, which actually brought in a lot of disabled politicians.
Oh, wow.
And so for the first time, there was actually, I think, 2 or 3 candidates with disabilities who were elected to the upper house. And because of that, actually, they renovated the upper house to become wheelchair accessible.
Oh, wow.
So that these politicians could serve their terms. However, policy-wise, he's pretty much a space alien. I remember he's very famous for theatrics, but not really the kind of person who I could see a lot of people thinking would make a great governor. And in, all honesty, I think we've said on this podcast before that the governor of Tokyo actually got more direct power than the Prime Minister of Japan. Right. This is not a job for, somebody who's a razzle-dazzle kind of person. You need someone who's an ass kicker, someone who can really get shit done.
How cool would it be if we got Koike to be on our show?
Come on, it'll be great. Well, she is fluent in English, so maybe we can...
That's what I'm saying, It's really cool in Japan how there are so many different political parties. The reason I say this is cool is because I have a lot of American friends who kind of jealously comment on this fact. Because, in America, we're so divided right now. I don't think in the States adding 1 or 2 extra would be that progressive and helping spread things out a bit more. But adding a lot, like the same way Japan has, right? Which, about 150 years ago, there were a lot of different political parties that would run for election in the States. For one reason or another, we've just settled on Republican and Democrat.
Well, speaking of people who sure as hell aren't going to get elected to become governor of Tokyo, another person we have to mention is Takashi Tachibana. He is an upper house member who leads the NHK Kara Kokumi o Mamoruto, or the Party to Protect the People from NHK. And so it's kind of funny, but there are 2 reasons why his candidacy is utter garbage. The first reason is that NHK is a national broadcaster.
Right.
And so if he wants to crush NHK, then I can see why he wants to be in national politics, but being the governor of Tokyo doesn't really give him a better platform to crush NHK. And he's still running on that same platform.
That's funny. That's their main goal, is to crush NHK.
The second reason why he's garbage, and this is a really good reason, is that he is an absolute racist.
Ooh, wow.
And so in a video published last year, Tachibana called for population control to maintain global peace.
Yikes.
And I quote, Tachibana said that the more foolish a country is, the more it reproduces. That country is made of a foolish race.
Wow. When did he say that? Last year?
Last year.
2019.
And so, exactly. And so he also said, let's just say that we should practice genocide against a race that reproduces like an idiot.
I've got my hands up in the air. I can't believe this is coming from a 2019 politician in a developed country. Wow.
Wait a second. He continued to say that people who are reasonably intelligent should be allowed to live while the rest should be slaughtered.
What is it with these Japanese politicians kind of trying to say, I mean, even more so than the States, I think we have like super extremists here, whether they're racist or they want to... There was one up in Hokkaido. There was some governor that just proposed that Japan goes to war with South Korea. Do you remember this?
Isn't that the guy who later said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was drunk"?
Yeah, I think he had to go to the hospital immediately after.
Yes.
Like that's the escape, is as soon as they say one of these super, extreme things, it turns out, oh, they were very sick and...
Palpitations. I'm palpitating right now.
Yeah.
No, I mean, honestly, I'm just kind of I'm unhappy that even though this Tachibana said this last year, that he's still even allowed to do something like run for governor. Obviously, anybody can do it. So actually running for governor is quite easy in this country. And to give you an example of how easy it is, there's also this year, again, we will have the wackiest political candidate I know of. His name is Teruki Goto, and he will be running for the gubernatorial race again. And he is best known for being a musician, and perhaps even more than his music career, known for making crazy posters and policy videos.
So lots of propaganda?
Yes, the policy video he produced, and so each politician, when they run for the governor election, has an official policy statement video, and it's all in a set format, and it's on NHK. And ironically, this Tachibana used this policy video to basically talk trash about NHK for 5 minutes, but everybody gets their 5 minutes of fame, basically. And so this Teruki Goto used his policy video in 2016 to talk about his Johnson.
No way.
Yeah.
No way. Oh my God. There you have it, folks. Japanese politics. Wow.
And so one of Goto's posters actually depicts him naked in front of some traditional Japanese-looking designs. And the only way that he was able to publish the poster without hitting the censors is that his name is covering his Johnson.
I'm just shaking my head right now. Politics just seems to attract the craziest society, I think.
And apparently a couple of exhibitionists. And the occasional wannabe bloody dictator.
Yeah. Up next, in a more serious news story, 7 people accused of illegal online fertilizer sales.
The Mainichi has reported that Tokyo police have submitted documents to prosecutors on June the 17th accusing 7 people from 6 prefectures of selling fertilizer online without filing an application with their governors.
The Metropolitan Police Department Consumer and Environment Protection Division has accused 7 people aged between 37 and 54 from Gunma, Chiba, Fukuoka, and 3 other prefectures on suspicion of violating the Fertilizer Regulation Act.
Police believe that the internet sales of fertilizer without prior notice has been growing rampantly as home vegetable gardening has become more widespread.
The Fertilizer Regulation Act stipulates that a notice must be filed with the prefectural governor when producing and selling fertilizer to prevent damage to human health, among other reasons. The MPD says the 7 suspects are apparently the first to be accused of violating the law for online sales of fertilizer by individuals.
All 7 were quoted as saying that they were not aware that they were committing a crime. A 37-year-old male suspect from Gunma Prefecture, northwest of Tokyo, was accused of selling 360 grams of plant and wood ash fertilizer for 690 yen on a flea market app without notifying the governor in July of 2019. The other 6 also allegedly sold plant and wood ash, as well as other fertilizers.
Of the accused, 3 are suspected to have produced the fertilizers on their own by burning wood at home without filing an application to make fertilizer. According to the MPD, the suspects are thought to have prepared the fertilizer for their home vegetable gardens, but divided the surplus into small bags for sale.
You know, Aaron, it starts really simple, just a few grams here, a few grams there, and before you know it, you're slinging fertilizer by the pound.
This is just kind of sickening. It just starts with a few guys, like you said, and it's going to spread and become a systemic mess in society out here.
I had heard that Japan had a very serious fertilizer problem, but I had no idea it was this bad.
This is bad.
I mean, what about these irresponsible people? I mean, these are, grown adults. Aren't they thinking about the children? Honestly, these suspects are most definitely hardened criminals. I mean, they said that they prepared the fertilizer for their home vegetable gardens. Likely story. These guys knew that they were going to sell it on the black market.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
Aaron, we can only imagine the sinister things that people are trying to fertilize with this. I mean, wood ash? Do these people know what wood ash fertilizer from illegal sources can do to your plants?
Parker, I don't want to get too speculative here, but I'd say that what these guys are doing has just some kind of connection to some other stuff that's going on in the world right now. I'm not sure what kind of group they're associated with. I'm not sure what they believe.
Honestly, where there's illegal fertilizer, you know what else there is?
What's that?
Illegal droppings. That's what they use to make illegal fertilizer. These guys say they were burning wood. That's bullshit. They've got illegal farm animals taking illegal shits to make illegal compost. And with this illegal compost, under dubious contexts, they are creating illegal fertilizer. By the gram, by the kilogram, by the ton.
All right, up next on The Weird Thing of the Week, we're going to continue demystifying Japan's famously weird real estate market and talk about buying property in Japan.
You're now listening to Tokyo Wave. The Weird Thing of the Week.
Oh, hell no!
So when you're buying property in Japan, you have so many things you need to think about. And of course, some things are specific to the Japanese system, but other things, maybe even many things, are just the same as it would be in any other country. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, location, location, location. And in Japan, that often means its proximity from the nearest train station.
Right.
And so in the Tokyo context, that means that properties that are inside the Yamanote line are at somewhat of a premium, especially if they are in what is considered as one of Tokyo's high-end residential districts.
A lot of people think that Tokyo is the most expensive place to live in the world, and when they look at the statistics, they often only look at properties inside the Yamanote line, right? A lot of people don't know that outside of that, the property value drastically goes down.
Well, even within the Yamanote line, some things, especially towards the north end of the city, can be surprisingly inexpensive.
Right.
But at the same time, it's all about what's the area, what's the surrounding look like, and obviously, Tokyo's real estate market, one thing, whether you're renting or you're buying, one thing to always keep in your mind is that there are so many properties on the market, and the market moves so quickly. Mm-hmm. So whatever the majority of people are looking to buy or looking to rent, that's the direction where everyone is going.
Yep.
So if you want something that's in vogue, you're going to have to pay for it. But possibly the same way as the fashion industry, some things are in style even though they might not be what you want. So if you can move a little bit differently from the way the entire market is going, then sometimes you can get a really good deal.
Yeah.
A couple of examples, for instance, I think Kichijoji and Shimokitazawa are two super famous, trendy neighborhoods, but just a few decades ago, they were just regular residential areas. But then, one thing led to another, and all of a sudden there's fancy cafes everywhere. It's almost like gentrification without the gentrification.
Yeah. On the note that you said that whatever's most popular is going to be obviously what's most expensive, the great thing is, for me and you and for other foreigners here, a lot of the times the kinds of apartments or properties we're looking to rent or buy are very different from what the Japanese are looking for. I found that to be quite helpful in cost reduction and, saving money with this whole process.
Definitely. And of course, everyone has their own specific wants and needs. And obviously, first and foremost, is when we're talking about renting, it might not be as big of a deal because, you can always leave with your 1 month notice. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to buying, I think where people who are used to renting in Japan need to shift their mind to focus on is about land and history in the area and the specific location where they're looking to buy. Because obviously throughout Japanese history, and especially in the Tokyo context, we can see how the city has developed. And, even outside of Tokyo, cities around Japan, they developed around rivers and mountains and shrines and rice fields. And obviously later in the nation's history around reclaimed land.
Yep.
And so by looking at the history of how that area came to be and, what was it 50 years ago? What was it 100 years ago? What was it 400 years ago? Mm-hmm. You can see how that area has developed over time. And long story short, the areas that have been residential and have been seen as a prime place to live have been that way for a long time. And the areas that weren't usually have less of a premium.
Right.
Sometimes, for instance, there could have been an area that was like low-laying land or floodplain 400 years ago. They've made a lot of dams in the last 400 years.
Yeah.
So it might not be that big of a deal if something is, for instance, in a lower area. But at the same time, we do see issues of natural disasters. So actually, one very popular area in Setagaya Ward in neighboring Kawasaki City along the Tamagawa River recently had a serious issue when a major flood caused the levees to break and water from the overflowing Tamagawa River came in to ruin areas of Futako Tamagawa and also Tamagawa on the Kawasaki side.
I remember this. This was probably the most stressful typhoon my entire time in Japan. Yeah.
I'm sure you heard the stories of people living in a high-rise in Musashi Kosugi that was deeply damaged by the flood damage, and for weeks their water did not work and their electricity did not work.
Yep.
So whenever someone who was living in this 40-story tall skyscraper wanted to take a poop, they had to walk down however many floors it was and find a place that would let them poop.
Yeah, and as you were talking about the history of reclaimed land and the dams that they've built over the past 100 years, it's extremely important to pull out those maps. And even in East Tokyo and in Kasai area, a lot of my friends actually lived below the elevation of which the levees were holding up the water along certain dams, and they had to evacuate. So that's just terrifying, But, had they have, maybe looked at the maps a little bit more and understood that these areas were in danger of being flooded if a typhoon that big came, it's a good thing to check out the maps first.
Definitely. One also, land is one thing, but also the buildings can be another thing, because even if you're in a good area, natural disasters, whether it's a typhoon or a flood or an earthquake, obviously the various curveballs that Mother Nature throws at us can be particularly scary when you're thinking about living in a house that might not be that structurally sound. And so another thing that people need to look at when they're thinking about buying especially is new construction versus older buildings. And what I have to tell you is maybe a little bit different than what you might hear in other places, but the age of the building does not matter. The quality of the building matters a lot. Right. There are lots of cases, and actually cases that have gone to court about new construction but poorly built construction that ended up not holding up to the elements, or basically falling apart sooner rather than later. And in some cases, that is criminal negligence or can be disputed in court. But a lot of the time, people don't realize it until after, whatever warranty they had has run out. So new construction does not mean good construction. And of course, with older buildings, you have lots of issues that come with age. But at the end of the day, you want to find a structure that is solid. Whether it's new or whether it's old, you really want to look at, okay, when this building was constructed, were they cutting corners or were they really trying to make a quality structure that's built to last? Which in Japan can be a bit of a question because a lot of structures in this country are built to last for the period of depreciation, which is 35 years for wood-framed homes and 45 years for reinforced concrete structures. Obviously, each building is different. So there are some wood structures that are extremely well built, and there are also some concrete structures that are extremely poorly built. So your building material does not necessarily correlate with better or worse, but you have to look at every building and look at, especially if it's a pre-owned structure that's been around for several years, you have to look into certain places to see, is there flood damage? Are there leaks? Are the floors flat?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Are the walls straight?
Yeah. I remember showing people apartments and the floors not being flat and, making all weird crickety noises when you step on them. And yeah, that's definitely a bad sign right there.
Well, and also, especially if you're looking at a condominium versus a freestanding home, you really have to look at the thickness of the walls between the different units because even within, most larger apartment buildings are made out of reinforced concrete, but they obviously, every time they build one of these buildings, they have to decide on how thick to make the walls.
Yes.
And obviously, the thicker the walls are, the smaller the rooms are. And, you can't sell walls.
Yeah. I remember I would, it's kind of an old trick and cheesy, but, literally knock on the walls to get a feel for how hard and how resonant they were, right? So, yeah.
I've knocked on a lot of walls in my day. You gave her a good knock, boy. And so going back to the land side of the equation, when you're looking at land, for instance, if you want to buy a piece of land that does not have a building on it, your calculation on what that land is worth is all about the frontage to the road. And so, for instance, you'll see a lot of properties on the market, whether it's land or it includes a structure, when you're talking about single-family homes that have a small entryway, maybe like 2 meters wide, and then there's a driveway or a walkway, and then you've got this kind of, it's like a flag shape, where you've got a big piece of property that's only connected to the road by a small strip.
Right.
And so these pieces of property can be bought proportionally cheaper than pieces of property that have the frontage. But if you don't have enough runway to get into the property, obviously that's going to cause issues with construction. And if it's too narrow, actually, there might be restrictions on the ability to rebuild if there's a structure already there.
And then also, I know when you buy properties here in Japan, there's a huge discrepancy between owning the land, owning the house. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't.
Yes, and so specifically, sometimes you will see a really good deal on a house, and you'll be like, whoa, this looks too good to be true. And then in the fine print, you'll see that the land actually is a long-term lease.
Right.
And so in that situation, you buy the building and you purchase the right to lease the land. And that's always for a fixed term period. In some situations, this can be an extremely good deal, especially if you want to have a larger house. However, you always have to look at the conditions of the lease. And so in some situations, you can indefinitely renew this long-term lease, and you can pass it to your kids and their kids and their kids' kids' kids. But in other situations, at the end of the term, if the owner of the lease doesn't want to renew, there are some types of leases where the owner of the land can cancel the contract and demand that you return the land to them without a house on it.
Right. Just like we were talking about with the rental agreements, looking at the fine print for the renewal arrangement is extremely important. Is it really a renewal, or do you have to cut the contract and then start a whole new one with completely different conditions, right?
Yes. One interesting anecdote is I always wondered, what is with all of these pieces of property that are on these long-term leases? And there's a bit of history and also an interesting religious facet. So a lot of land you see around temples and shrines, where obviously there are houses built, that land is in many cases actually owned by the local temple or shrine and rented out via these long-term leases to families living on these residences.
Ah, I see.
So it's almost like a revenue generation model for these religious institutions.
Makes sense. So they can kind of control to the families, make sure that the families that have been there for hundreds of years stay there and everything.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's impossible to give a comprehensive advice on what you should do when buying property in Japan, but obviously, I think a lot of people in Tokyo especially are always thinking to themselves, do I want to have a condo or do I want to have a single family home? Mm-hmm. And you can have this debate wherever you live in the world. I think probably among megacities, Tokyo is probably special in that you can find surprisingly good situations with single family homes, wherein other areas you might not have the same opportunities to get these kind of single family structures for under $1 million even.
Right. Yeah, that's something that's very particular and special to Tokyo. I mean, anyone looking in this area, I would say, be adventurous and don't just limit yourself to inside the Yamanote line. Look outside, look north, look west.
Go west!
Yeah. All right. So that wraps up this week's talk on real estate in Japan. There are quite a few interesting topics regarding real estate. I imagine in the future we'll talk about investments and being an owner as well here in Japan of real estate property. So if you guys have any questions for us and you'd like us to talk about it on the show, please reach out to us at wave@tokyowave.jp. That's wave@tokyowave.jp. And we will answer your questions and discuss it here on the show. All right, so coming up next, we're going to talk about a very special place in Japan on this week's Random Inaka.
You're now listening to Tokyo Wave. Random Inaka.
So Parker, back in 2017, I took a break from work and traveled with 2 American friends up to Hokkaido that fall. I had never been, actually. Have you been to Hokkaido yet?
Hokkaido is the top of the list of places that I really want to go to, but I just haven't been yet.
So for those who do not know, Hokkaido is the northernmost island here in Japan, and it is most renowned for the high quality and freshness of its seafood, as the cold waters surrounding Japan's northernmost prefecture are ideal for fish and sea vegetation. Within the prefecture, some areas are particularly famous for certain products, such as the uni or sea urchin.
Ooh, yeah, that reminds me. Whenever someone goes to Hokkaido, I'm always like, bring uni and ikura. Or we can't be friends anymore.
Yeah. And obviously, if we talk about Hokkaido, we can't talk about it without mentioning the crab. Really, everyone living in Japan talks about it, but it's worth restating. The crab in Hokkaido is the best. You can literally pick any random izakaya in Sapporo, order a crab-based dish, and you will be in gourmet heaven. This is exactly what me and my friends did for about 5 days straight.
So after 5 days of eating crab 3 meals a day, did you get crabby?
Got very crabby and very relaxed. It's so damn good, man.
Which one?
So another really big thing that stood out to me was Sapporo, Hokkaido's capital city, and the way the streets were organized. So, us living in Tokyo, which is really built on a random mess of curvy streets, is a stark contrast to the nice open grid system Hokkaido harbors that is really reminiscent of a more western city like New York City or Boston.
I know. Whenever I look at Sapporo on the map, it always looks weird. It's like, what is this? Is this Japan? Because everything is so nice and organized.
Yeah.
And, I think the most Japanese cities have really kind of built organically over centuries. And I think that Sapporo was really kind of planned out with a master plan. So it's really the way that Sapporo grew is fundamentally different from pretty much any other Japanese city, I think.
While traveling through European and Asian cities over the course of my life, I noticed a common difference they embody in contrast to New York City, Chicago, and other American cities. These European and Asian cities, they don't do the grid system very well. So cities in Europe and Asia grew over centuries rather than decades. They had no overarching design. However, this noticeable tendency does not hold true for Sapporo. So as you said, Sapporo is a grid expanding out from the center, a very tall TV tower in which everything, intersections and buildings, was addressed with a number, a cardinal direction like north, south, and number and another non-opposite cardinal direction. So, when I traveled there, it was very consistent and extraordinarily efficient, very easy for anyone going there for the first time. The streets are wide, unlike most old world cities, and the oldest buildings are from the 19th century.
So why does Sapporo so closely resemble an American city?
So first and foremost, it was new. It only started developing as a city in the 1870s. Second, it was a colonial city. So Sapporo, unlike other Japanese cities, doesn't have a clear meaning in Japanese because the words come from the Ainu who lived in the area before. This is similar to how most cities in Florida are named after indigenous Native American tribes that used to inhabit them. Third, Americans had a large part in Sapporo's design. The Japanese brought in help from the undisputed experts of colonizing unbroken, previously inhabited lands.
So Americans.
Yeah.
Dun dun dun.
The colonialists have arrived.
Nobody expects the American colonialists.
So one of the revered figures in Sapporo's history is William S. Clark, who only spent a year there developing Sapporo Agriculture College, now Hokkaido University. William S. Clark was part of the Union during the American Civil War and is famous for leaving his adoring Japanese students with the line, "Boys, be ambitious." These parting words are preserved in a statue of him on a bluff overlooking the city.
Wow, I actually had no idea about this. What an interesting part of Japanese history.
All right, and this is probably my favorite highlight of being in Sapporo, but while we were there, we did a day trip out to a city called Otaru. Have you heard about the city, Parker?
Yes, my impression of it is that it's very westernized.
If Sapporo, the capital, reminds you of a large 18th, 19th century downtown, then Otaru is the countryside equivalent of that. And you're still in Japan during all this too, right? Which is really cool.
Oh God, I feel it.
What is it?
It's coming. The narrator voice. Otaru is a small harbor city about an hour and a half northwest of Sapporo by train. Its beautifully preserved canal area and interesting herring mansions make Otaru a pleasant day trip from Sapporo or a nice stop en route to or from Niseko or the Shakotan Peninsula. From the early days of Hokkaido's colonization in the late 1800s, Otaru served as a major trade and fishing port. It was since chosen as the terminal station of Hokkaido's first railway line that connected the port with nearby Sapporo. Many old warehouses and former office buildings by shipping and trade companies give Otaru city center a special character reminiscent of past decades. Otaru Canal is a waterway carved into the coast, leading in from the sea. It was once used for transporting cargo and goods. Old warehouses line the edge of the canal. Take a stroll over the bridge or along the promenade by the side of the canal. The boats that cruise along the waterway are also very popular among tourists.
So I couldn't agree more that Otaru is so nostalgic and reminiscent of past decades. While I was walking through the streets there, I started to feel like I was in the middle of a Ghibli movie. Ghibli's creator, Miyazaki, is famous for creating these bustling cities and very quiet countryside cities in his work that are very reminiscent of 18th and 19th century European cities with a mix of Japanese aesthetic. That being said, no area in Otaru resembles this more than Sakaimachi Street. So, although it is often said that traditional Japanese shopping streets fell into decline with the arrival of modern shopping malls in the suburbs, Otaru Shopping Street lives on and thrives. That being said, it is actually hard to tell where does the street start and where does it end, because it's not a shopping arcade. Instead, various historical buildings line up along the so-called Wall Street of the North. In fact, the street starts at Sakai Ichome near Otaru branch of the Bank of Japan, built in 1913. It stretches for approximately 750 meters till Irifuni Hairi Crossroads, where you can see Otaru Music Box Museum. Along the street, you can see old merchant shops, stone bank buildings, warehouses, restaurants, and handmade glass stores. Business hours and holidays vary depending on the shop.
This really sounds a lot like Karuizawa. Does it have that same kind of vibe? Because Karuizawa has that shopping street.
Yeah, so Karuizawa, I would say that Otaru is obviously, like I said, it's more 19th century stone connected streets. Karuizawa is a little bit more modern, a little bit more spread out. Otaru feels just everything's so close.
Wow, so it's like, are you talking about like cobblestone?
Yeah. It's got lots
of...
Yes. I mean, honestly, if you've ever seen Kiki's delivery service, just imagine being transported to that city and boom, you're in Otaru. And the canal we talked about too, the canal area, it feels like you're in a part of Spain or Italy or something. I mean,
yeah, when you say canal, I have like this idea of like a Venice-like situation.
It is. And
have they got boats?
I think they have boat tours. And also, if you cross the canal and go out towards the ocean, there's this one other street out there where there's painters, people playing music outside. I mean, it's like Barcelona or something, like
that's crazy.
It's so cool. It doesn't feel like you're in Japan at all.
What's the food like?
So Hokkaido is famous for dairy, right? And then in Otaru, they have a lot of candy shops, including a very famous cheesecake place called Lutao. And there they have this double fromage, which is incredible. So it's their flagship product. 2 layers of cheesecake with cheese mousse and baked cheese. The cake is made with fresh, thick, smooth Hokkaido cream that just melts in your mouth. You can also enjoy this in the store, and we did. I think we sat there and ate maybe 4 to 5 different kinds of cheesecake, and after that, just wanted to take a nap and quickly get back to the hotel and sleep.
I mean, just listening to that, it's like, I don't know, do you think they could have put a little bit more cheese in it? Just like sprinkle some cheese on top?
I gotta say, out of all the cities I've visited in Japan, Otaru is the closest to a European city. You really feel like you're somewhere in Western Europe.
Talking about Hokkaido and its European influences reminds me that the next city over from Otaru, Yoichi, is actually the birthplace of a famous Japanese whiskey.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever heard of Masataka Taketsuru?
No, I have not.
So, have you ever heard of Taketsuru whiskey?
I think I might have seen it written on a whiskey bottle before.
And it's really good whiskey, too. So, Taketsuru Masataka was a Japanese chemist and business person who founded Japan's first whiskey distillery. He was born in 1894 in Hiroshima Prefecture to a family who had owned a sake brewery since the 1700s. In December 1918, a young Taketsuru decided to move to Scotland and enrolled at the University of Glasgow, where he studied organic chemistry in the summer of 1919. Later that year, Taketsuru began his apprenticeship at Longbourn Distillery in Strathspey, Scotland, and then in July at James Calder and Company's Bowness Distillery in the Lowlands region. Then in 1920, he married a local girl, Jessie Roberta Cohen, whose nickname was Rita, despite opposition from both of their families. Actually, their relationship was recently depicted in the hit NHK drama Massan.
Ah, yes, I've seen that.
So initially, they lived in Campbelltown, and his last apprenticeship began later in 1920 at the Hazelbird Distillery, before they moved to Japan later in the year via New York and Seattle. After returning to Japan, Taketsuru worked at Kotobukiya, which would later become Suntory, where he helped establish a whiskey distillery. Then, in 1934, Taketsuru founded his own distilling company in Yoichi, which is the town right next to Otaru. Taketsuru decided to create this distillery because of Yoichi and that region's climate being very close to that of Scotland. He believed that this part of Japan in northern Hokkaido was, in fact, the most similar to the Scottish climate.
Wow. Yeah, it's all connected.
The company he founded, which is now known as Nikka, has honestly what I think is Japan's best mass market whiskey.
It has got to be probably the best whiskey I've ever had. No, hands down, man. It's so good.
So everyone talks about Suntory whiskey, and obviously Yamazaki and Hibiki and all the other whiskeys that Suntory makes are extremely famous, and they're very good, but personally, I am a much larger fan of the whiskeys made by Nikka.
Oh, yeah.
And both their Taketsuru and Yoichi brands are extremely good.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned, I've never been to Hokkaido, so I have not visited the Yoichi distillery, but I have had the opportunity to visit the Sendai distillery, and comparing it with distilleries in the United States, where a distillery tour can be quite expensive, I was flabbergasted and pleasantly surprised to learn the price of a distillery tour at Nikka's Sendai distillery. How much do you think it was?
$10.
Free.
Ah, nice.
And
Yeah.
so it's not just a tour too. They even have free samples. So they take you on a proper hour-long tour of the entire distillery, and at the end you get, quote unquote, one free sample. But they sure have a whole lot of samples that are left out there after everyone's gotten one. So it's only one on paper, but
Yeah, and it's really interesting to hear the story about Nikka really coming from and being inspired by and being set up in Otaru because of its likeness to a European area, a European region. It's kind of no surprise having been there. I think any Japanese that visit Europe and come back might even want to settle in Otaru if they really enjoy that kind of aesthetic. Because, it's just a really quick plane ride out of Tokyo, and then all of a sudden you're in 19th century Europe. So
I actually have a friend, and so probably the only reason why I've never been to Hokkaido is because when I do travel around rural Japan, I love to go by car.
Oh, yeah.
And Hokkaido, unfortunately, is not connected to the island. So the only way you can get to Hokkaido by car right now is by ferry, and it takes a decent amount of time.
Yeah.
And of course, you have to drive up to the top of Japan to take that ferry. Unless there's actually ferries that you can take from Ibaraki and also from Niigata Prefecture, where you drive, and if it's Ibaraki, it's about 2.5 hours, or maybe 3.5 hours to Niigata. And then from there, you load the car into a ship, and then you take a cruise up to Hokkaido, which is, I think, 2 or 3 days.
That sounds cool.
Which sounds like the exact thing that I would love to do this summer if it weren't 2020.
Yeah. Personally, I'm a bullet train kind of guy. A lot of my friends think it's crazy, but they have bullet train tours too up to Sapporo from Tokyo. And, you'll stop every 2 days and spend the night in a different city along the Shinkansen. But I mean, I love traveling on Shinkansen personally. So
What is a little bit more relaxed than the airplanes? And I feel like, especially given the situation we're in this year, maybe a little bit safer. I'm not sure if there's a big difference there, but just the whole thought of going to an airport and getting on an airplane right now just, it scares the bejesus out of me. So anything that's not that.
yeah, I don't think anyone wants to breathe in recycled air for more than 2 hours at this point. So.
2 seconds.
Hey, listeners, that's right. You listener right there.
We want your feedback, comments, and ideas. Drop us a line at wave@tokyowave.jp. We will listen to your ideas, and we might even try something new.
We hope you enjoyed Tokyo Wave.
If you haven't already, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube.
Join us again next week on Tokyo Wave.